Hey class, welcome to week 5. This week we're going to be discussing the process of implementing public policy. And that's usually something that falls to public administrators throughout all levels of government, local, state, and federal. So these are the topics that we're going to cover. I'm going to kind of take a practical approach to this. We're going to go over some important definitions, look at top-down versus bottom-up implementation, then get into policy implementation failure, why that happens, and then ways that we can design policies so that they don't fail, and policies that can kind of tackle these wicked problems that we often have in the environmental field. And then we're also going to do a case study of FEMA's responsiveness. Okay, but first, I want to talk just a little bit about reading court opinions and writing case briefs. So most importantly, good job, you guys as a class. You did a really nice job on the PETPO brief, especially considering it was probably the first brief that most or all of you have ever written. And I did take that into account while grading, because as I promised, I'm not grading you guys like you're in law school. Really, as long as I can tell you're putting in the effort, then your grade's going to reflect that effort. And please, please talk to me or post questions on our Q&A discussion board if you're ever stuck, because it's okay for you guys to work collaboratively in sort of figuring out the legal research aspects. I do want to talk about the PETPO brief in particular, but I also want to give some tips for reading court opinions and writing case briefs, just kind of in general, because you're going to have another one in a couple of weeks. Okay, so let's start with general tips for reading a court opinion. I've covered a lot of this in the legal research lecture, but it is worth repeating because the world of legal resources can be confusing and non-intuitive, and I know that. So before you actually start reading a court opinion, first thing you should do is look to see where it actually starts. So usually it takes at least a page or two to get to the beginning of the actual opinion itself, because first you've got to go through lists of attorney names and such, and if you happen to be using Westlaw or Lexis or Nexus Uni, there's going to be key cites and headnotes before you get to the actual opinion. Second, look to see if there is a case summary. Court opinions, we usually call that a syllabus. And the syllabus functions similarly to an abstract in academic journals, so it's a really good overview of the court's opinion. The syllabus, also known as a case summary, is always located at the beginning of the case before the actual opinion. And a lot of courts actually write their own syllabi to include with the published opinion. Don't ever cite to the syllabus, but definitely use it as a Cliff Notes version of the court case. Okay, third, skim the case, and I really do mean skim. Like literally glance through the pages to get a sense for how the court organized its opinion. So typically these will be organized in somewhat of an outline format. So for the PETPO case, you'll see that the court organized its decision using Roman numeral 1, 1A, 1B, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3, etc. Fourth, search for keywords. And you can literally use, Control F to find these keywords. So I searched the PETPO opinion for the phrase "we hold" and found 2 instances. I searched for "we conclude" and found 4 instances. And these are really the key parts of the court's holding. It's also good to search for words like merit, because often that'll let you jump right to the meat of the case. Because a lot of times courts have to first dispense with jurisdictional issues like standing before they really get into a case. And while those jurisdictional issues are crucial to the court, and we will talk about them later this semester, they're usually not the most important part of the actual case. So once you've done that, go ahead and read the case. But remember, don't bother reading all the citations to other cases, citations to statutes. That's just going to break up your flow. And also remember that judges, like all lawyers, are verbose and have to cite to precedent. So it may take a court 3 pages to say what a normal person could say in 2 sentences. So you'll note in the PETPO case, the opinion went on and on about standing at first, but what it boils down to is that PETPO had standing because it suffered a concrete injury that could be remedied by the court. So when you write your case brief, Think of case briefs like flashcards that you would use to study for a class, but in this case you are studying for legal principles. So the fact that PETPO is about the Utah prairie dog specifically is less important than the fact that the PETPO holding applies to all purely intrastate species of limited economic value that reside on private land and are regulated by the Endangered Species Act. So in your case brief, include the name of the case and its proper citation on the same page as the rest of the brief. Even if you use a cover page, you should still, on your main brief page, have that case name along with the facts, question, holding, and rationale. That way, if you lose your cover page, you still have a viable case brief. You should cite to the official citation. So that's one of the reporters, Federal Supplement, Federal Reporter, U.S. Reports. That's the proper citation. You don't have to remember this on your own. You can always refer back to our legal research guide and our week 3 lecture slides. Now, also, you shouldn't need to use any citations in the body of your case brief unless you're specifically quoting the court. Then you can use a short version of the citation. But you shouldn't even be doing that because really these case briefs should be in your own words. So official citation, not to Lexis, it's got to be to an official reporter. When you are using your own words to write this case brief, save space and, use that space for what's truly important. When I'm grading your briefs, I'll make comments like unnecessary. And when I say that, I'm not being critical. I'm just letting you know that this is something that you can cut out in order to free up room to discuss more important aspects of the case. You should dedicate most of your space to the rationale section, with the next biggest chunk going to the facts section. The question and holding sections should really only be a sentence or two. The facts should focus mostly on what the facts are that are relevant to the dispute at the heart of the case. You might need to briefly summarize how the case moved through the court system and the decision of the lower court, but you really want to focus on the facts that the court rendering its decision is actually examining. So the question section, also sometimes called issue of law, that has to be in the form of a question. And then the holding section should answer that question starting with yes or no. So the question and holding sections kind of mirror each other, and they should include all of the same elements. They should also aim to be more broadly applicable. So while the holding in the PETPO case is important to PETPO, the organization, in that particular time and place, it's also important to every other individual and organization that finds itself regulated by Fish and Wildlife Service in similar circumstances. It is also broadly relevant to how the Fish and Wildlife Service operates. So then the rationale section has to explain the holding. Again, it's got to do so in your own words. I really cannot emphasize that enough. I even posted here in that little box part of our lecture slide from week 3. You've got to use your own words unless there is some historically worthy and important phrase the court uses. Now, if you're stuck, you can always refer to the case briefs that I have provided. The assignment guidelines, that's got the case brief for Roe v. Wade, and our week 3 lecture slides contain the brief for Miranda versus Arizona, which gives us the right to remain silent and other Miranda warnings. So do please remember that we've got these legal resources available to you, and you can always ask your classmates, and you can always ask me. Okay, so as I said, we're going to get into the actual PETPO case itself. The facts section, it should focus on the facts relevant to the dispute at the heart of the case. So again, you might have to briefly summarize how this went through the court system, but focus on what the court is considering when it renders its decision. So like what happened between the parties, why are they arguing, what do they want, and then what are the facts relevant, that the court finds important. In the PETPO case, relevant facts were that the Fish and Wildlife Service regulated a species that is designated as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, but it is a purely intrastate species, that has no substantial effect on interstate commerce on its own. The Utah prairie dog is just a sort of non-commercial creature. And it resides primarily on non-federal land. So those are some important facts. Also important is that Fish and Wildlife was regulating the Utah prairie dog because the Endangered Species Act sets forth a broad regulatory scheme. And by enacting the Endangered Species Act, Congress granted Fish and Wildlife Service the authority to regulate. Now, Congress cannot grant authority that it does not have itself, and so Congress rationally believed that the Commerce Clause, in this instance, provided that authority. When looking at the fact section of all of your case briefs, I think what surprised me most was how many people actually skipped the part about the prairie dog's lack of commercial impact. So keep in mind, this is a case that hinges on Commerce Clause authority, so noting the impact of the prairie dog on interstate commerce, or lack thereof, that is really important. So the question section, which you can also call the issue section, again, has to be in the form of a question. The holding section should answer that question, and it should start with yes or no. The question and holding sections, again, they mirror each other, and so they should include all of the same elements. So for example, in your PETPO case brief, if your question mentioned a purely intrastate species, then your holding should also mention a purely intrastate species. Now, you want your case holdings to state a more broadly applicable principle of law that can be understood by somebody who's not read the case, who doesn't know all the specific facts about the exact case. So keep in mind that part of the reason for briefing a case is to understand how these cases affect our rights and responsibilities. Think back to Chevron, that Chevron case, in which the Supreme Court, they set forth the legal test for determining how much deference to grant a government agency's interpretation of a statute that that agency administers. The specific facts of Chevron related to the EPA's interpretation of the word source in an environmental statute. And while it might be interesting to understand those facts, to learn how the court decided on the Chevron doctrine, the real utility of the Chevron case is that it created this doctrine that applies to all agency actions. So the original agency in the case was the EPA, but the Chevron case has been cited by courts nearly 18,000 times, and by scholarly articles another 24,000 or so times. And you don't need to know any of the facts that lead up to Chevron's decision to understand and apply the holding. Much like in PETPO, you don't need to know that it was a group of ticked-off Utah property owners feuding with their local prairie dogs who sued Fish and Wildlife Service. You don't need that information to understand that the 10th Circuit confirmed that the Commerce Clause grants the federal government the ability to regulate something that has sort of a tenuous connection at best to interstate commerce. The PETPO case did pose another question, and that was about whether PETPO, the organization, had standing to sue. As I said, we're going to talk about the concept of standing later this semester. Really briefly, standing is the right to be heard by a particular court about a particular matter at a particular time. So in order to have standing, you must have suffered an injury. That injury's got to be related to the defendant's actions or inactions, and the court has to be able to provide you with some form of relief if you were to win the case. Now, courts always have to address standing to show that they've got the right to hear and rule on a case. Once in a while, the concept of standing is the most important part of a case, but usually it's just a box that's got to be checked off before the court gets into the real issues. That is why I suggest searching for a keyword like merit, because often the courts are going to indicate that they're turning away from sort of the regular housekeeping portion of the opinion to the substantive and more important part. So in your rationale section, don't waste time quoting the court. Courts are always going to use more words than they need. Instead, you should write the rationale section as though you were explaining the case to a friend. So what are the most important reasons why the court ruled as it did? And what is the easiest way to summarize those reasons? I will say that putting a court opinion into your own words is definitely one of the most challenging parts of a case brief. Even seasoned attorneys struggle with this. But putting it in your own words is the best way to ensure that you really understand what the court said. Okay, so what is the rationale for the 10th Circuit's decision in PETPO? Why did the court determine that the feds have the authority to regulate a purely intrastate species with no economic value that doesn't even live on federally owned land? The court looked at the facts of the case and the history of the Endangered Species Act, and it examined the arguments that were raised by the parties. Because PETPO, the organization, was arguing that Congress overstepped the authority granted to it by the Commerce Clause, the court went ahead and looked at the Commerce Clause. And that grants Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce. You don't have to spend a lot of time saying that because it's just kind of a fact. The court then determined that Congress intended to promote long-term commerce for the entire nation by protecting various species under the Endangered Species Act. Because if those species disappeared, then that could have a negative impact on interstate commerce overall. Next, the court reviewed the Endangered Species Act to determine if it created a comprehensive regulatory scheme. So remember, back in week 2, we discussed the Commerce Clause and we discussed the preemption doctrine. And that says that Congress can preempt state law if it creates a comprehensive scheme of regulation. Now, the court in PETPO noted that that comprehensive regulatory scheme, it does not have to be about commerce. It just has to have a substantial relation to commerce. So in PETPO, the court relied on a case about the Controlled Substances Act. Now, nobody would argue that the purpose of the Controlled Substances Act is to regulate interstate commerce. The purpose is to criminalize certain drugs. But the Controlled Substances Act does create a thriving black market for drugs. And similarly, in PETPO, the 10th Circuit found that the Endangered Species Act protections of certain species create an illegal market for trade in those species. And the illegal market is a commercial activity, because if Congress can regulate commerce, it can also prohibit commerce. Now, of course, this illegal market would not exist without the Endangered Species Act in the first place, and it is hard to imagine that the Utah prairie dog would be of any value either in a legal or illegal market. So in part, I'm actually surprised that the Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal from PETPO and let the 10th Circuit decision stand, because that decision may have some really broad applications in the future. The Cato Institute, for instance, argued that the 10th Circuit's reasoning would basically apply to any organic life and all organic life in the US and say that it's subject to federal regulation. I think that's a bit hyperbolic, but given the Supreme Court's Commerce Clause jurisprudence over the past 2 decades, it is surprising to me that the court didn't view this as a classic federal overreach, view the actions of Fish and Wildlife Service as an overreach. The fact that it didn't is probably an indication that even though we have a conservative-leaning Supreme Court, the court has decided that it's time for that pendulum of Commerce Clause jurisdiction to swing back to favor the federal government. Okay, so that is it for our court opinion and case brief discussion. Now let's get into policy implementation. So this week, we're going to focus on a single distinct stage in the policy process, and that is implementation. Or maybe it's not a distinct phase. As with many questions about law and government, the answer is yes and no. It is a distinct phase, but it's impacted by other phases, and it in itself impacts other phases of policy design. But anyhow, so we're going to discuss implementation. I'm going to focus more on a practical approach to policy implementation. I am going to talk about theory here and there because it's sort of impossible to avoid, but my goal is to really highlight challenges and potential solutions that are facing administrative officials when they attempt to implement policy. So I'm a lot more focused on practical matters and a lot less focused on theory. Okay, so first what we're going to do is cover some relevant definitions. That way, we just make sure that we're all speaking the same language for the purposes of this lecture. So first off, public policy. Because if you're going to define just policy, then you've got to take into consideration organizational policies, from non-governmental organizations. But we specifically want to talk about public policy, which is a statement of intent and the courses of action or inaction, plus any regulatory measures, social welfare programs, and funding priorities that are promulgated by the government and designed to carry out the intent of the government and usually solve societal problems. Now, public policy is heavily influenced by economic, social, and political problems, no surprise there. And different public problems and policy issues, they have different stakeholders. And there are many times when dealing with each different stakeholder actually requires either a different public policy or a different approach to public policy. So in this situation, we've got these numerous individuals, corporations, nonprofit organizations, and other interest groups that compete with each other and that collaborate with each other to influence policymakers. So this makes public policy quite complex. And it also means that regardless of the type of policy that you implement or the problem that you're trying to solve, policies have both intended effects and they also often have unintended effects. And that's where later in the lecture we're going to talk about the benefits of collaboration and feedback. So you're probably aware of Theodore Lowy, a political scientist, and he proposed 4 types of policies: distributive, regulatory, constituent, and redistributive. So distributive policies, they basically extend goods and services to citizens and also distribute the cost of those goods and services across society. So if you think about, government policies that impact spending for defense and welfare, public education, highways, public safety, those are benefits that will benefit a lot of members of society, and you've got to spread the costs of those somehow. Then there are regulatory policies, and those tend to limit the discretion of individuals or other organizations who are basically the regulated parties, the target parties. So it either limits their discretion or it compels behavior, it forces them to do something. And so these policies are best applied when, you can pretty easily define good behavior and you can pretty easily catch and regulate bad behavior, primarily at an administrative level through fines and sanctions. So for example, a regulatory policy that works really well generally is highway speed limits. Other regulatory policies that tend to negatively impact special interest groups or particularly political donors, they face more challenges. Then there are constituent policies, which actually create power entities within the executive branch, or they deal with laws that kind of confer some of these broad costs and benefits to society. So when we talk about constituent policies, it's mainly about the development of new departments, an internal redistribution of funds, or new rules for public servants. And so an example of a constituent policy would be that after the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, the federal government established the Department of Homeland Security to prevent future terrorist attacks. So it established a department and it vested it with executive power. Then there are the redistributive policies that transfer one group's tax fund to another group, trying to basically eradicate a social issue such as poverty or some other social issue, and basically create a more equal level playing field. So these policies are often framed as benefiting the poor over the rich. You take tax money from rich people and then you fund subsidized housing for low-income people. But these policies are also used to consolidate power in the hands of the rich or the elite. Basically, a good example of that is cutting off collective bargaining rights, which happened in Wisconsin, and there was the big teacher strike on that. So these policies that are redistributive, they can take from the rich and give to the poor, but they can also take from the poor and give to the rich. Policy design, moving on in definitions, is the attempt to craft a comprehensive set of visions, goals, causal assumptions, rules, tools, strategies, and organizations in order to address a particular problem. Good policy design should align the problems with solutions, interests, and organizational resources that can actually carry out those solutions to solve the problem. Policy implementation is the actual action that we take to put a law into effect or to create a solution to a problem. So policy implementation, it can include creating guidance documents. It can be rulemaking, formal or informal, like we talked about last week. Perhaps it is providing technical assistance to states and local governments, or doling out grants to states and local governments or non-governmental organizations. Implementation is really the administration of the law, and it involves various actors and procedures and techniques that work together to put these policies into effect. And basically, it's an effort to attain a policy or a program goal. So at its very basic, policy implementation is how the government makes a policy work. Implementation failure occurs when the government does not make a policy work. And that is defined as a significant gap between planned outputs and outcomes of a policy and what actually happens in real life. And then there is public innovation, which is the way that we develop and implement sort of groundbreaking ideas that disrupt the status quo. And they create what we call a step change. So a step change is a transition from incremental progress over time, and a lot of government policies do rely on incremental progress, to a more dramatic improvement. Basically, even better than incremental progress, now you're really like moving full steam ahead. And you can see sort of in the image here, you've got your incremental progress, and then all of a sudden, rather than continuing on that incremental path, you just really take off and you achieve this step change. And that really requires collaboration with a lot of different stakeholders, because you've got to build broad political and administrative support in order to ensure proper implementation. Okay, so often we think, is this a good policy or a bad policy? And we debate that. Is this a good policy, a bad policy? Really, for our purposes, there are no inherently good or bad policies. Now, I say for our purposes because obviously something like ethnic cleansing is going to be a bad policy no matter what, and we're talking hopefully more realistically in the world of, US political administration. So rather than thinking, is the policy good or bad, it's better to think about policies, they could be more helpful or less helpful for any given situation. And so you've got to examine that on a case-by-case basis and say, is this policy more helpful for this case or is it less helpful? And you can contrast being banned from campus and being banned from, getting into the campus's nuclear research reactor. So before a public university can ban a specific individual from campus, it's got to go through a pretty lengthy process, because as a public, state agency, you've got to respect an individual's First Amendment rights, and those include free speech, free assembly, and the ability to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And in this case, the university is part of the government, and if you've got ticked off people, they can come and complain. And normally you can't kick them off of campus just for complaining. You've got to have like an administrative adjudication, sort of like a court trial, that's got a hearing officer, the defendant. Well, you've got to, say why it is that you're banning this person from campus. They're entitled to certain rights in presenting the case and defending their conduct. Now, on the other hand, a policy that bans most individuals from getting into the campus's nuclear research reactor, those have to be fast and easy to implement. And that's because it's public safety and national security issue. That policy also affects most people in the same way. So rather than banning one single person, you're actually excluding a large group. Most of the people on campus are excluded. So a policy that would ban somebody from campus by, having the cops like storm their dorm room or something with guns and forcibly remove them, no consideration for constitutional rights like due process, that's a terrible policy if you need to ban somebody from campus for being a pest, but it's a really good policy if somebody's gotten into your nuclear reactor and they don't have permission to be there. So part of the issue with policy implementation is that a lot of people just focus on the win, and that's getting the bill signed into law. And while it's that law that sets policy, getting a law in place is really just the very start of the process. Implementing the policy is the real focus, both because it's necessary to carry out the policy and because so many things can go wrong at the implementation stage. And because it's agency bureaucracies that play a huge, pretty much outsized role in policy implementation, people who make policies in Congress and in state legislatures, they need to understand what organizational structures are going to help or hinder policy implementation, what organizational constraints, both internal and external, will create problems to sort of effectively and efficiently implement policy, and also have to understand what potential incentives exist that will assist an agency in properly implementing policy. So you've got to know the carrots as well as the sticks. So after the win, policymakers and administrators, primarily administrators, have to focus on policy implementation strategies. Policies can be both structured and implemented from the top down or from the bottom up. So when you look at top down, also called command and control, this is a centralized process. You basically have a single puppet master pulling the strings to control the situation on the ground. Now, I say puppet master like that's something evil. I'm actually just trying to sort of invoke that image for you. Not an evil image, just one person pulling a lot of strings to get stuff done. These top-down implementations and structures are pretty formal. They've got to comply with constitutions, laws, court decisions, international agreements, and interstate compacts. Top-down is often a faster and more efficient process because of the limited number of people involved, but that limited number of people involved means that policymakers aren't getting input from other actors throughout the organization or actors external to the organization, and so they might be missing out on potentially valuable information. That failure to engage a wide variety of actors can also result in resistance to policy implementation, particularly later in the process if frontline administrators think that the policy is unworkable, or if they think policymakers really didn't take into consideration important factors. They might give up and start to resist the policy. Now, sometimes that can be good. We've sort of seen that with certain Trump administration policies that wouldn't be great for the country, and you do see some of this bureaucratic resistance to it, but that's also not really appropriate. As much as I am grateful for our government agencies for trying to maintain a status quo in a difficult situation, they are supposed to be responsive to the president and the administration. But resistance at the administrative level happens across all different levels of government under all different types of political parties, particularly if there's some type of a personality conflict between the head of an agency and the line staff. That's going to cause serious resistance. The top-down approach, it does take into consideration a variety of complex factors and how they interact together, but really not getting that input from the front line where they're the most knowledgeable about those factors really just creates a lot of challenges later in the implementation process. So top-down, it can be efficient and quick, but it doesn't necessarily work in the long run all of the time, particularly not for more complex social, environmental justice types of issues. Bottom-up structures are a more decentralized approach. So it's slower. It responds to problems in their specific context. So bottom-up is a more collaborative approach. It does try to take into consideration information and skills that are provided by actors throughout the system and across systems, so inside government and outside. Bottom-up implementation does try to create sort of a feeling of joint ownership amongst the policymakers and the people who are implementing policy. because they feel that joint ownership, it prevents ignorance of the policy, and it also prevents the resistance that I was just talking about, not only from administrators, but also from regulated parties, because all of the stakeholders understand and know how to tackle a problem, if it's been working from the bottom up with a lot of collaboration. Now, there are challenges, of course, to bottom-up implementation, and that includes a lack of participation and a lack of dialogue. And you see this a lot if there's no framework for or a tradition of participation. So particularly public participation, if your town or city doesn't have a strong framework of that, it's probably just not going to happen organically. So if residents of a city never attend city council meetings, it's going to be harder for the city council and city administration to really engage the residents. And both policymakers and administrators are going to have to expend more effort on public outreach. So regardless of policy type, policy implementation failure is shockingly common. Classical political scientists always operated under the assumption that policies are going to be smoothly implemented by efficient government bureaucrats, and they're going to solve the problems that the policymakers intended to solve. So really smooth, well-greased operation. But in reality, it's very hard to effectively implement all pieces of a policy initiative, even if it's a good one. And implementation failure has become increasingly common really over the past 10 years. There was a 2008 study by Deloitte Research that showed that nearly half of public leaders in the US think that the federal government is less capable of carrying out policies than it was 10 years ago. And then there were some other studies that showed that federal government policy failures actually doubled from the period of 1986 to 2001 to the period of 2001 to 2015. So part of the reason for those increasing policy failures is growing societal complexity. So that makes it really difficult to reach out to fragmented groups. And even outside of the policy spectrum, if you think about, back in the 80s, we had 3 television channels, 4 if you happen to get Fox, and this is, of course, if you didn't have cable. But my family, we had 3 TV channels. And so it was, a lot easier to get a large number of people to watch the same program because there just wasn't a lot on. There weren't a lot of options. Now we've got thousands of channels, and it's much harder to get a large number of people to watch the same program. Even the Super Bowl ratings are down. So part of the reason for these failures over the past 10, 20 years really is just because of societal complexity. Part of it's administrative constraints. There are resource issues. There are often staffing issues, particularly at the federal level. The administration, the bureaucracy has been poorly staffed, and it's had a lot of retirements lately, and they're not really effectively replacing personnel. And so that makes it harder to carry out policies. Failures of public leadership, particularly as sort of partisanship increases, that's a reason for implementation failure. And then also we're getting a lot better at spotting it. So there is an increase in failure, but there's also an increase in our ability to spot failure. And this is primarily thanks to sort of a renewed emphasis on performance measurement in public policy. Now, the danger of failure is that whenever there's a gap between policy and implementation, that gap undermines both the legislature's capacity to govern, because it's going to have to pass more policies. And if the public doesn't trust in the ones that have already been passed, why are they going to trust in these new ones? And so it can really ultimately undermine the public's trust in government entirely. So policy implementation failure, definitely a big deal. Okay, so why are we going through so much failure? Other than, what I mentioned before about we're spotting it better and there have been these breakdowns. If you look to traditional implementation theory, and as I say that, I'm reminded that at the start of this lecture, I said I wasn't going to get too much into theory, so my apologies. But these traditional implementation theories tend to blame policy failures on obstacles that are within the government bureaucracy. They don't really give any thought to obstacles that might be present in the legislature where policy is made. So there are, again, top-down and bottom-up explanations for policy implementation failure. as well as an outside-in failure explanation. So the top-down explanation for policy failure is that the implementation process just takes too long. There are too many decision points throughout the implementation process. Each decision point, the signal coming from policymakers gets weaker, and sort of deviations from the implementation plan appear. And each deviation makes it less likely that the policy is going to be properly implemented. So you can think about this top-down explanation, as policy implementation becomes like a game of telephone. The message gets garbled, and so the frontline staff who get that final message, they don't implement it. They don't implement the policy as policymakers intended because they're not hearing the correct definition of the policy. So that's top-down, like a game of telephone. The bottom-up explanation for policy failure is that there's too much discretion exercised by frontline staff, and all of that discretion throws off the implementation process. So it's these frontline staff, sometimes they're called street-level bureaucrats. These are the folks in government who work with the service users and who work with regulated parties. And they do have a lot of discretion in defining their goals and selecting the tools to meet those goals. But on the other hand, they are really often caught in a crossfire of contradictory commands. Those come from elected officials in both legislative and executive branches. So Congress and the president, agency heads and other appointed political officials. They've got to pay attention to what the courts are telling them to do or not do. There might be professional norms and ethics in play. There might be different needs and demands of the public, including the general public, people who need certain government services, and also regulated parties. And then there are media talking heads who scrutinize every move. So there's a lot of contradictory commands being thrown at frontline staff. They also have really limited time and resources, both human resources and otherwise. So they don't have a lot of ability to respond the way that policymakers might intend. So because of these contradictory commands, all these intensive time pressures, and limited resources, eventually frontline staff develop coping strategies. And so those coping strategies, they might try to reduce the demand for government services by, say, limiting access to the services, by limiting office hours, or automating service delivery, so you have to go through phone menus and websites rather than talk to a human. They might attempt to tightly control regulated parties and the public. We're recently seeing that. The Department of Interior's made a recent move to restrict public information requests under FOIA. And they're basically trying to do tight control and also rationing who gets FOIA requests by creating these artificial caps. So these various coping mechanisms or coping strategies can detract from proper policy implementation. All right, so that's bottom up. Contradictory commands to street-level bureaucrats, they've got discretion, things kind of just go out of whack. There is also an outside-in explanation for policy failure, and that is that you've got unintended or unexpected behavior from citizens, service users, and regulated parties, and it's those unintended behaviors that create a resistance to implementation. So these traditional implementation theories have always assumed that everybody is, going to act appropriately. They're going to comply with all the rules. They're going to respond appropriately to sanctions and to incentives. But in reality, there might be ignorance, there might be opposition, and non-compliance by groups that don't like a policy or that don't understand the policy. And so having a section of the public that's completely ignorant of your policy certainly creates challenges to successfully implementing it. And having a section of the public that's directly opposed to your policy, creates a whole different set of challenges to implementing it. So you get frustrated line staff who don't have sufficient resources, and so this external resistance, it can really overwhelm an agency's ability to respond to problems very quickly. And we will see that towards the end of the lecture when we do our case study on FEMA. So you've got all of these classical implementation theories, and they create a firm separation between politics and administration. So they are separating the policy making, policy design, and the policy implementation. And they usually ignore the fact that policy design can affect policy implementation, and policy implementation can affect policy design. So then there is, after the classical theories, we've got new public management. And this form of public administration draws on theories and techniques from the private sector, and it applies those to the public sector in an attempt to make the process of governing more efficient and more business-like. So new public management, it focuses on importing performance management techniques from the private sector, creating new forms of leadership and management to really sort of engage frontline staff, make them buy in so that they're embracing policy goals and they're working hard to implement them. And it also focuses on treating citizens as consumers, because the goal is to have citizens feel that they're empowered by the policy to make choices and to express their opinions, because that makes them more likely to feel that a policy is legitimate, even if it doesn't necessarily align with their interests. So that's new public management. But it continues to reinforce the separation between policymakers and policy implementers. So distinction between the legislature and agency bureaucracies. And because it continues to reinforce that separation, it doesn't address any flaws in policy design and how those flaws can really impact the implementation phase. So I am not saying here that new public management techniques don't work, because many of them do. I'm just saying that it's got a blind spot when it comes to potential decision points for policy failure, because it's focusing on problems of administration, but not on the problems of politics. And if we want to be really successful in implementing policies, we need to address the interactions between policy design and policy implementation. So new public management, worth studying, as it's one of the three main factors that actually influence the policy implementation process. The other two are networked governance and socio-political context. So new public management, it's advocating for outcome-based performance. Results-oriented government is the phrase that gets bandied about. So it's stressing performance outcomes. Those performance outcomes are typically set by statute. And that means that agency managers have to prioritize activities that will ensure that they're going to meet their statutory targets. The focus on performance measurement does actually help agency management because it allows them to monitor policy implementation. It provides feedback at various points along the implementation process. But if you're focusing too heavily on meeting targets, that can lead to additional blind spots and unintended effects. So for instance, No Child Left Behind Act, that created these test-based performance standards for teachers. And so teachers began to teach to the test rather than just teach in the way that works best for them and for their students. So new public management, one of the major factors influencing implementation. Networked governance is another one. And networked governance is a recognition of the fact that policy implementations got to involve coordinating across multiple organizations and also coordinating within organizations, multiple levels of actors. So network governance has a lot of names. We call it partnerships, public-private partnerships, coalitions, consortiums, all of those. That's all networked governance. And you've probably noticed that these networks are actually growing larger and more complex. There's a network for everything these days. And these networks actually have been sort of overtaking formal government institutions in terms of the fact that they're dominating policy and implementation. Network governance, it can also apply to the vertical relationships in an agency hierarchy and the horizontal relationships amongst different government agencies. And really, networked governance is the joining of those vertical and horizontal relationships so that you create this integrated structure at the local, state, and federal level for policy design and policy implementation. So thanks to coordination amongst actors, these sort of network structures allow policy ideas to take shape in real time. So they kind of let them play out as real-world actions. But network governance does have its own set of challenges, because as you involve more and more parties, that means there's more and more people at the negotiating table, and those people have multiple interests and distinct constituencies. The other major factor influencing the implementation process is the socio-political context. And that's literally the social and political pressures of the day that are influencing policy and policy implementation. And that includes the opinions of all of those people at the negotiating table because of network governance. So the socio-political context, it impacts all levels of the policy process because it determines which outcomes the government is going to value and how the government is going to prioritize constituent needs. And this context, like I said, becomes more complicated because of network governance. You're bringing more people to the table. All these different people can have these different, potentially conflicting values, interests, and goals. Also, the power distribution between those people can be vastly, heavily weighted in favor of some. So people who can afford high-powered lobbyists, they're probably going to have an outsized influence on policy and implementation, even though they might be a minority of the constituents. So this is when you see sort of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now, the best way to overcome these socio-political hurdles is going to be through negotiation and compromise. The political will, unfortunately, to negotiate and compromise is often sorely lacking, as we have seen, primarily because of increased partisanship and also a fear of being punished by your more extreme constituents. And this is why we've got the GOP fear of being primaried, which drives Republicans to adopt more extreme policies that appeal to a minority of their constituents, but it's the minority that votes and might get them out of office if they don't shift their thinking. So policy failure can result from poor implementation, bad policy design, failure to adapt to conditions on the ground, and even media-enhanced partisan politics. Most implementation theorists focus on poor implementation by agency personnel. But think about this. If a policy is flawed or ill-conceived at the start, when it's making its way through Congress, it's going to be almost impossible to implement. It doesn't matter how dedicated your agency personnel are or how closely they're going to adhere to legislative intent. It is just difficult to implement a flawed policy. Regardless of why a policy fails, that failure tends to lead to frustration for almost everybody, and that includes elected officials, bureaucratic officials, regulated parties, and the general public. Now, policymakers who don't understand the situation sufficiently enough to make good policy, or those who fail to anticipate problems at the implementation stage, they tend to wind up with flawed policies. If the input is flawed or incomplete, then the resulting policy tends to fail. In addition to problems that are caused by a failure to understand, the problem you're trying to solve, or failure to anticipate hurdles to solving it, policy design is also flawed when policymakers face political pressure to adopt a policy, even if there's no real evidence that it works. We see that in criminal justice with our 3 strikes laws and the war on drugs. They're prime examples of policies that were enacted due to political pressure rather than scientific evidence. Policy design is flawed when policymakers face political pressure to reject a policy, even when evidence suggests that it will work. And we're seeing this a lot, in debates over climate change. Policymakers also come up with flawed designs if they're facing, extreme political pressure not to cooperate with the other side. There can be sort of extreme ideological convictions that make it challenging to cooperate. They might be facing time pressures. They might need to act really quickly. Policymakers a lot of times have vague or even contradictory goals, so they kind of create this garbled policy that fails to properly guide implementation. We've seen that quite a lot in the present administration. They might also fail to engage the street-level bureaucrats, and those are the people who have skills and resources and practical knowledge that can help policymakers. And then there is the often popular decision of policymakers to pass the buck to agencies. If there's going to be a policy that might be unpopular with that policymaker's constituents, then they just kick the can down the road and make the administrators deal with the problem during implementation. So they're basically refusing to deal with some of these substantive issues at the design stage and forcing that on to the implementation stage. Sometimes also policymakers just fail to create a good story. You know, if you're going to try to pass a law, particularly at the federal level, you need to have a good story and an elevator pitch that the public can readily understand and respect. And this is why, in my opinion, Democrats are terrible at framing policies, even when they're great policies that will benefit many people. Democrats can't seem to tell a good story. You know, they get really bogged down in a lot of technical details. Republicans tend to be a lot better at telling a story. So any of those reasons, or a combination of those reasons, can lead to implementation failure. And that happens before any single administrative bureaucrat even gets involved. On the other hand, good policy design can really usher in these step changes that we talked about. And they can make a huge difference, especially if you're trying to solve wicked problems. So the term wicked problems, it describes problems that are especially resistant to resolution. It was coined back in the 70s in the context of social policy problems, basically saying you can't clearly define a problem, and there are so many differing perspectives of stakeholders that it's going to be almost impossible to resolve the problem. These are also difficult or impossible to solve because you've got incomplete, contradictory, and even changing requirements that you might not even be able to recognize at the outset. And these problems are so complicated, and often different pieces of them are interdependent. So if you solve one aspect of a wicked problem, solving it might actually reveal or even create other problems which might be worse than the problem that you just resolved. So some standard, kind of classic examples of wicked problems would be climate change, healthcare, opioid crisis, social injustice, things where you can't find one basically indisputable public good. You can't find one objective definition of equity or equality. And so that just makes these problems specifically challenging. Wicked problems do have some defining characteristics. So they're not understood, usually not fully understood at least, until you've already started formulating solutions. They don't have a stopping rule. And what that means is there's no mechanism for deciding whether to continue or to stop a process based on where you find yourself in relation to past events. So normally a stopping rule, you get to a point where there's going to be a decision to stop some process at a certain time. Wicked problems don't have that because you might not be able to stop a process, you might not understand what process to stop, or you might be afraid that stopping a process is going to lead to a worse problem. And that's because solutions to wicked problems are not really right or wrong. It's more complicated than that. It's not a black and white situation. There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of need for cost-benefit analysis. There's a lot of need to kind of examine social justice issues as to what your quote solutions are going to do, what intended and unintended effects they're going to have. All wicked problems are essentially unique, so you can't necessarily learn from past experience. Solutions are usually a one-shot operation. You've got one chance to get it right, and you really don't have any good alternative solutions. So that is what makes these problems wicked. To resolve them, we've got to shift the goal of how we take action on significant problems. We've got to shift from a solution mindset to an intervention mindset. So instead of seeking an answer that's going to totally eliminate a problem, we've got to recognize that these actions occur in an ongoing process. We're always going to need to take another step. We're always going to need to do more to solve the problem, but we have to keep intervening and coming up with policies that intervene to mitigate the harms that these wicked problems create. So there are three main strategies for resolving these: authoritative, competitive, and collaborative. Authoritative strategies, they basically want to give all responsibility to solving the problems to a very few number of people. This is sort of like an extreme top-down command and control. They get to reduce the complexity and just sort of plow ahead. But the disadvantage is that the people who are charged with solving the problem, they might not actually have a full appreciation of all the perspectives that they need to truly tackle it. There are competitive strategies that try to solve wicked problems by basically pitting opposing points of view against each other. Basically telling the parties, that hold those opposing views to come up with a preferred solution and sort of fight it out. Darwin's law, best solution gets chosen. That, though, means that you're sort of creating a really confrontational environment that discourages sharing of knowledge. And so the parties involved, again, they might not have an incentive or the knowledge that's necessary to come up with a best possible solution. Then there are collaborative strategies, and these aim to engage all stakeholders to find the best possible solution for the greatest number of stakeholders. And typically, collaborative approaches require a lot of meetings where you discuss issues, discuss ideas, find a common ground, and then agree upon an approach. So there's no one best way to design policy. That said, good policy design should really properly, accurately, and completely examine the problem to be solved, and examine it from multiple perspectives. You want to look at all sides of the problem, get input from all sides of the story, all actors up and down the chain and horizontal. Good policy design should really ensure that the goals, tools, and strategies are plausible, that the agency that is being tasked with implementing a policy, given its current staffing and resource levels, and given the complexity of the problem, you want to make sure that that agency can actually plausibly carry out implementation. Good policy design should consider innovative and bipartisan policies, really try to create collaboration between the upstream and downstream actors, and that involves private as well as public stakeholders. Because sort of if you can really involve people in a bipartisan discussion, you can actually break through some political logjams, and you can tackle some of the unpleasant trade-offs of wicked problems. A solution's going to cause a problem here, so you collaborate with the group that's going to suffer from your solution, and you work with them to come up with ways to mitigate that suffering, so you can get around these trade-offs. Good policy design should support the agencies that are tasked with implementation. They've got to have personnel, they've got to have technology, they've got to have appropriate budgets. They also have to be flexible. They have to be able to adapt to changing conditions on the ground. And like I said, they've got to tell a good story, because you need the public and all stakeholders to accept that story. If they do, they are more likely to accept the policy as legitimate, even when it's negatively impacting them. Now, good policy design is often achieved through this collaborative policy-making approach. If a collaborative approach is well designed and effectively led, you can establish common ground and you can get these creative solutions. But you've got to include upstream and downstream actors, agency personnel, regulated parties, citizens, other stakeholders. You also have to recognize that this approach is continuous. You need street-level bureaucrats to provide feedback on prevailing conditions on the ground, and then that feedback has to allow policymakers and implementers to adapt as their new conditions or new challenges appear. So the ability to adapt to unfolding events, including events that are created by decisions made by other actors, that's really a key to policy implementation success. So taking a collaborative approach to policymaking, it really does facilitate adaptive implementation of policies. So when you've got collaboration from top level down to street level, you get a better understanding of the conditions on the ground. Frontline staff can help identify needs, not just needs of the service users or regulated parties, but also skills, competencies, and resources within the agency. And if you meet those needs, you can improve agency performance, which improves implementation. Collaborating with local stakeholders, that'll generate political support. Also provides constructive feedback to policymakers. Collaborating with regulated parties helps you detect problems early on while they're still manageable. And they allow policy to be adapted as necessary, and again, they get some buy-in from those regulated parties. And then collaborating with user groups, citizens who are using your services, if you collaborate with them to evaluate the success of a policy, you might actually spur co-creation of better solutions. So you get this feedback to policymakers who then refine the policy, and then it's implemented better for the people who are regulated or impacted, and then they give additional feedback, and it's just sort of a positive cycle. That is not to say that there are not challenges to a collaborative approach. I was going to say it's fairly easy, but I should say it's not too difficult to motivate frontline staff and private stakeholders and regulated parties to adapt this collaborative approach, because the approach actually gives them some more power and political influence. But at the same time, politicians don't really want to give up any power or any more power, because legislatures already give power to agencies to regulate. Additionally, within the legislature, resistance to compromise is a huge hurdle to collaboration. And we see that in our current Congress and in the handful of past recent Congresses. Strong distrust amongst different stakeholders, that's a big challenge to collaborative policymaking. Strong ideology hinders or even kills collaboration. If a politician's got absolute belief in his correctness, moral, political, ethnic, whatever, why compromise? If you feel that you are absolutely right, then you might not compromise. You can also have politicians who depend on, a small but strong base, or politicians who are tied to special interest groups. They might refuse to collaborate because they're afraid that their base is going to take issue, if they compromise with the enemy, or they don't want to lose donors. And not wanting to lose donors can lead to inappropriate decision-making or total lack of decision-making, so it can lead to non-decision-making. The 24/7 news cycle is also a big challenge to a collaborative approach, because it really pressures politicians to adopt immediate solutions. Not necessarily well-considered solutions, but fast solutions. The news cycle, it pressures them to adopt short-term solutions that ignore long-term problems, or it pressures them to refuse to act entirely. And that's the whole reason for our government shutdown. The recent government shutdown. Trump was going to sign the bill to fund the government, and then he listened to a couple of talking heads, 24/7 news cycle, and he decided no, he wasn't going to act at all. So the media really can have a huge influence on policy implementation and policy failure. So challenges aside, the collaborative approach really is sort of an integrated view of the policy implementation process. It includes top-down approaches, bottom-up influences, outside-in influences, vertical and horizontal relationships, and continuous feedback and refining of policy and implementation procedures based on that feedback. It's a collaborative, adaptive approach to policy making and also to policy implementation, and that requires sustained dialogue and mutual learning. So we want to be able to enable bipartisan dialogue and compromise. We want to ensure appropriate interaction between politicians, subject matter experts, both internal and external to government, all levels of agency personnel. You want to have proximity between the policymakers and policy implementers. That's really important. And that's why, federal agencies have headquarters in Washington, D.C., near Congress and near the White House. It's because proximity is important. And you want to have engaged agency personnel who are going to feel ownership of the solution. You also have to involve private stakeholders in the policy design. You've got to have that dialogue between governmental and non-governmental actors, as well as within the government and across governments, so state, federal, and local. So if you involve the public and you involve regulated parties in policy design, that's going to provide more of an opportunity to feel that ownership of the policy and to push for a successful implementation. Collaborative approach also requires an effective implementation plan. Each portion of the plan should be subject to collaboration amongst the affected personnel and parties. And so, effective implementation plan, you want a decent description of the background of the project. You really want a clear statement of goals and objectives and frame that in terms of outputs and outcomes. You want to discuss resource implications. You know, what budget do you need? What personnel? Do you need training requirements? Do you need different facilities? You want to put together an implementation schedule for the project. And that schedule should also describe how actions are going to be taken, who is taking those actions, and who is managing different parts of the project. The implementation plan should also list potential hurdles or obstacles to successful implementation and some ideas on overcoming those hurdles. You also want to include reporting and review arrangements. Who reports to who? How often are you reviewing implementation to make sure that it's being effective? Reviewing requires an evaluation plan. You know, how are you going to measure success? And then you actually have to carry that out and have evaluators come in. There also needs to be a feedback mechanism to adapt the implementation to factors that are found in the evaluation. So basically, the evaluator tells you something's working or something's not, and the agency needs to be able to turn around and adapt its process. You also want a statement of risks and contingency plans. That's different than potential hurdles or obstacles, because hurdles and obstacles, they might be risks, but they might not be risks that are going to cause public health and safety problems. So you want to separate out things like legal challenges from public safety risks. And then your implementation plan and your project plan should have an executive summary. And that summary should be short. I'm talking 2 pages tops. And it needs to provide all the basic information, your main goals, and your objectives in a concise paragraph, you know, just a few paragraphs. And so that way you can have an effective implementation plan, because right at the very start of it, everybody who reads that executive summary, you're already getting everybody onto the same page. Okay, so that is the collaborative approach, which I do think is one of the best ways to carry out public policies. Now we're going to do a little case study. We are going to focus on FEMA's hurricane responses, starting with Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and ending with Florence in 2018. I'm not going to get into FEMA's responses during the 2019 hurricane season, really in case somebody wants to use that as a topic for policy analysis memo. So before September 11th, 2001, FEMA was created. I was in the late 70s. And it was created by an executive order, and it was created as an independent agency by President Carter. FEMA was tasked with creating a comprehensive approach to federal emergency management. So there was both an executive order and a reorganization plan from the late 70s, and basically FEMA then assumed emergency management functions that had been scattered across the whole federal government. So it consolidated them in one place. After 9/11, but before Hurricane Katrina, President Bush, well, he had actually been focusing FEMA on terrorism even before the September 11th attacks. But after 9/11, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002. That created our Department of Homeland Security, which, as I mentioned, I think first week of this class, it was an enormous governmental reorganization. So the Homeland Security Act set DHS's primary mission as preventing terrorist attacks in the U.S., along with reducing our vulnerability to terrorism and minimizing damage and assisting in recovery from terrorist attacks in the U.S. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 brought FEMA underneath the Department of Homeland Security. Now, like I said, Homeland Security was far more focused on anti-terrorism than in coordinating any type of a general emergency preparedness response. That act also assigned a lot of the emergency preparedness and response functions that had been under FEMA, reassigned those to the Secretary of Homeland Security. And while FEMA retained its Stafford Act functions, and it was tasked with leading a sort of national all hazards emergency management program, the Secretary of Homeland Security transferred a lot of FEMA's functions, including almost all of its preparedness functions, to the newly created Preparedness Directorate or to other agencies within Homeland Security. And Homeland Security really didn't seek any stakeholder input on this. So it didn't, for instance, talk to stakeholders in areas that are prone to natural disasters. Homeland Security Act also directed the Homeland Security Secretary to build a comprehensive national incident management system that involved federal, state, and local authorities, and then to coordinate and consolidate all of the existing emergency response plans into a single coordinated national response plan, or NRP. And in 2003, then President George W. Bush issued a Homeland Security Presidential Directive. It's Directive Number 5. It was supposed to foster coordination across all different levels of government, but it really required a national approach, sort of a top-down national approach. So that was all after September 11th, but before Hurricane Katrina. Okay, so Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans August of 2005, and FEMA's completely unprepared. Nobody knew what actually triggered the National Response Plan, either substantively or procedurally. The National Response Plan was supposed to deal with incidents of national significance, but those were not defined. And the Homeland Security Act of 2002 did not provide any process to invoke the National Response Plan, nor did it specify any actions to take if the National Response Plan was triggered. So there was a total lack of direction, total lack of coordination with state and local governments, lack of coordination within the federal government, and as a result, FEMA was completely ill-prepared to respond to Hurricane Katrina. It was basically like one small part of this sprawling bureaucracy that was focused on terrorism, and it had lost control over its main preparedness functions. So after the Katrina disaster, with FEMA being so unprepared, Congress recognized some of the problems created by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and Congress passed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006. That act reassigned almost all emergency management functions to FEMA. It again established FEMA as a distinct agency within Homeland Security, and it actually exempted it from the Secretary's reorganizational authority. So the Secretary could no longer reorganize FEMA basically out of existence. That Post-Katrina Act also designated the FEMA administrator as a principal advisor to the President, to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and to the Homeland Security Council. So the FEMA administrator was recognized as the principal advisor on all emergency management matters. And the Post-Katrina Act affirmed that FEMA's primary mission is to reduce loss of life and property and to protect the nation from all hazards. And that includes natural disasters as well as acts of terrorism or other man-made disasters. So FEMA was basically told, yes, you need to have a comprehensive emergency management system, you need to be prepared, and you need a decent system of protecting, responding, engaging in recovery operations and mitigating harm. And this time, Congress involved stakeholders from all over. Congress involved federal, state, local government, non-governmental organizations, private actors, special interest groups, communities. All these people pitched in to create a new national response framework. It's the NRF. That framework eliminated the need for anybody to declare an incident of national significance. It just said, this framework is always in effect. It can be implemented nationwide. It can be selectively implemented if you need a scaled response. It incorporates organizational structures so that it can promote on-scene initiative, lets people on the ground, really engage in innovation and share resources. Really importantly, it defines roles and responsibilities across government, between governments, and with the private sector. And that framework focused on having engaged partnerships, being able to have tiered responses to emergencies, having scalable, flexible, and adaptable operational capabilities, had a unified command, which can be a drawback at times, and it also sort of made everybody ready to act. So these were good changes, but as we'll see, they didn't necessarily solve all of FEMA's problems. So Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in September of 2017. And again, FEMA's performance wasn't great. FEMA performed poorly for a variety of reasons. A major reason was that Maria was the third major hurricane to strike within a month. So FEMA was already shorthanded. They were already preoccupied with other major disasters, and that included Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas in August of 2017, so very shortly before Maria. And then Hurricane Irma, which hit Florida in September 2017, also hit the U.S. Virgin Islands. And then FEMA was also dealing with California wildfires. So a lot of its supply depots had already been emptied out in response to these other emergencies. FEMA had planned for up to 2 disasters at a time. They didn't have any contingency plans for 3 or more disasters. Other reasons why FEMA performed poorly in the response to Hurricane Maria was that mitigation and response, emergency response, it's just more challenging on an island than within the contiguous United States. Because if you're, in the mainland, you can rely on roads to move people and supplies. You don't have to rely just on air support and boats. FEMA also had not planned effective coordination with the Puerto Rican authorities. So, it was legitimately distracted, and it did face legitimate challenges of responding to a crisis on an island, but it also hadn't planned very well. It wasn't coordinating. The Department of Homeland Security didn't help things because it didn't immediately waive the Jones Act, which basically prevents Puerto Rico from receiving aid or any supplies from vessels that are not U.S. vessels. So basically non-U.S. support couldn't get to Puerto Rico in a timely manner. And the feds took a lot of flack for that, particularly FEMA, but all of Homeland Security. The federal response was it was slow and it was inadequate. And it was exacerbated by the Trump administration's refusal to acknowledge any shortcomings and the decision to pull FEMA personnel from Puerto Rico pretty shortly after the storm. So then there was the 2017 hurricane season after action report, and that focused on this lack of planning for concurrent emergencies, concurrent incidents. There was also a GAO audit that noted that FEMA's available workforce was just completely overwhelmed by all of the response needs in August, September of 2017. FEMA's staffers were just not prepared to deal with unfolding conditions, and they weren't physically able to handle sort of extreme conditions that they found in Puerto Rico. So after the 2017 hurricane season, FEMA took a lot of new initiatives on, including putting FEMA integration teams, FITs or FITs, in place before disaster strikes. So FEMA started embedding small groups of FEMA personnel within state agencies to coordinate sort of a seamless emergency response. And that meant no more delays in a response getting started. They didn't have to have, federal and state bureaucracies try to learn to work together on the fly. They were already working together. It allowed for an immediate and coordinated response. FEMA personnel, they knew where to find all the supplies they needed. They were able to, quickly distribute satellite phones to federal and state emergency responders. So they really, FEMA learned from experience, and it took that feedback and incorporated into new policy and new policy implementation for hurricane response. So FEMA was really preparing for the 2018 hurricane season. It was updating hurricane plans, along with states and tribal governments, and also U.S. territories. It was making vast improvements to staffing in terms of logistics operations. It was refining communications, so that they could use better satellite communications. And it was updating, some high priority national level contracts with government contractors so that they would be better prepared to respond to and cope with multiple concurrent disasters. FEMA also, after the 2017 hurricane season, and this was stated in a GAO report, it changed its approach to responding to natural disasters by identifying 7 lifelines, and those lifelines were what FEMA would reestablish immediately in the wake of destruction, or as soon as possible. And those were safety and security, food, water, and sheltering, health and medical, energy, communications, transportation, and hazardous waste management. So FEMA was preparing for all of that, and then Hurricane Florence hit. So Hurricane Florence made landfall in North Carolina, September 14th, 2018. And this time, FEMA was prepared. Before or just after the hurricane made landfall, the government had already deployed almost 4,000 federal employees, including 1,000 FEMA personnel, 1,200 search and rescue personnel, over 500 health and human services personnel. And FEMA was doing a really good job. It coordinated the response. FEMA was working with local governments to understand, gaps and weaknesses in preparedness. FEMA's response, they had 6 incident management assistance teams, which had senior level emergency management personnel. Those were the first in a disaster. They had urban search and rescue task forces, medical assistance teams, like 1,000 emergency assistance member teams who were deploying from other states to provide aid. Nonprofits were involved. FEMA had involved the Red Cross. That engaged thousands of volunteers to support FEMA's recovery efforts. And FEMA's responsible for those too. I mean, FEMA helps coordinate volunteer responses. So FEMA took all of the lessons that it learned from its complete failure from Hurricane Katrina, and it enabled organizations to start staging supplies for recovery in nearby locations before a storm even made landfall. So they were really doing everything possible to speed up the emergency response and also be ready to respond to multiple emergencies at the same time. And so this is a really good example of a collaborative approach. It had taken a top-down approach after 9/11 that failed pretty miserably. Unfortunately, a lot of people died or became homeless because of that failure. But rather than dig in, FEMA took the feedback, it evaluated its performance, both internally, and it had external, GAO and other external watchdogs kind of evaluate its performance too. And then it really learned from that, and it updated all of its plans, and it was much better prepared. So fortunately, FEMA did a much better job with Hurricane Florence. That doesn't mean that Hurricane Florence wasn't devastating, and certainly lots of people lost lives and lost property, but the government can't stop all bad things from happening, but it's good when the government prepares and they can really step in and stop a lot more bad things from happening. And that's what the collaborative approach is all about. Collaborating across governments, with non-governmental entities for the benefit of the American people. Okay, so that is it this week for the lecture. This week you've got a couple items due, and they are related. So you're going to submit a memo on adding a rare plant to the endangered species list. So go to the assignment section, you'll see that there's background information provided, and then you're going to have to prepare a memo. Your memo is going to be directed to the executive director of the Pollinator Protection Institute. That is not a real institute. And you're going to talk about whether small flowered rock crowfoot can be added to the federal list of endangered plants. Also, small flowered rock crowfoot is not a real plant, so don't try to look for it. What I want you to do is dig into the Endangered Species Act and its implementing regulations. And you're going to be able to work collaboratively on this memo, because I don't want it to be something that's overly challenging, and I think with legal research, it's oftentimes easier to get started by collaborating. And so that's what discussion 3 is going to be. It's going to be your workspace to collaborate. There is also going to be a question, so even if you don't want to collaborate with your classmates on doing the legal research and coming up with responses for the memo, you are going to have to post in discussion 3. Everybody is going to submit their own version of a memo. You can collaborate all the way up until the part where you write it and turn it in. So everybody submits their own memo. That is due Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Mountain Time. And then everybody has to at least answer a question in discussion 3, but I really do hope that you will use that as a collaborative workspace. You can also ask me questions if you are stuck on the assignment. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you on the discussion boards.